Welcome to Recombination Nation, the resurrection of zero input agriculture. If you're just tuning in, today I have a guest who I consider a friend. We have I've been on his podcast before, Fight Like an Animal. Arnold Schroder is a really rare individual who is exploring the intersection between biology and politics, a combination which is normally on the forbidden list of worldviews, which makes it all the more interesting and fascinating to explore all of the amazing things that he has investigated and thought about and shared with the world over the many years that he's been doing this. So, rather than me going on trying to summarize who you are, do you want to tell us like who you are and how you got to this place in life? Like give us a little kind of self-narrated this is your life kind of reflection on
Yeah.
how you came to be a kind of revolutionary anarchist biologist.
Um, yeah. It is one of those things. I like to quip that people sometimes say something is complex because they just don't want to talk about it. But it is one of those things where it's the other kind of complex. There's we were just talking before we press record about how life really is this accumulation of experience that gets more and more disorienting as you go along because it's kind of unimaginable and dizzyingly poignant that you've really done so many things and drawn so many inferences from the experiences you've had and all that kind of stuff. So a, a, a simple way to phrase it, how I ended up talking about it in the book that I finished writing pretty recently, is that my family is not one that has a lot of people who've like gone to college or anything like that. And I did not take a path through the academy really at all. I didn't even really do high school. But I really always did have this overarching fascination with biology and with animal behavior and human behavior as an instance thereof. I can remember doing evolutionary theorizing when I was like 8 years old. So it was always kind of just there for me. I don't really remember a time when I didn't think like that. But my path, like what I devoted myself to, was the environmental movement as I encountered it when I was young, let's say like the early mid 90s. And it was in those contexts that all of the experiences, all the like empirical foundations of the theories that I try to present in my podcast and in the book I've written and whatnot, where at least like the questions that I eventually started trying to answer were initially formulated. Um, and so I spent from mid adolescence into political work often occurs in phases. People kind of will dive in for a while, get their hearts broken, take a while to lick their wounds. Then, some of us come back, some of us don't. So, there's definitely like phases in here. But from the time that I was in mid adolescence, participating in the environmental movement, seeing the stuff that worked, the stuff that really didn't, and I think in particular the ways that really foundational stories about how the world works and human nature or the lack thereof kind of like really would show up in our political processes in ways that you wouldn't necessarily assume would happen. It would be very easy to imagine that people could have a blank slate theory of humanity or like not really understand the biology of aggression or whatever and still have a very practical coherent discussion about what to do about a concrete problem that they're deliberating about here and now. But what I found, this lifelong interest in biology manifested as me just reading a lot of scientific papers and stuff as a kind of parallel track to my political involvement. And I was kind of just like noticing how the disconnect really mattered, how
Yeah.
all of these kind of like social science theoretical frames that yeah, at some point I'd been born in the academy, but had really become like the default way of looking at the world that one encountered in social movements, how these were like really taking us in bizarre and often quite infuriating and pathological directions, right? And so, like decades of that ultimately. And I would say that I had this kind of final culminating phase of being in the movement landscape as I encountered it and really trying to make it work in kind of like the 2010s, let's say from like 2010 or so to about 2018, which was my window of time of feeling like, okay, we've probably set off some kind of irreversible process of climate change or a runaway process in any case. But those were sort of like the last years where it felt really compelling to me to try to shut down a whole lot of the current fossil fuel economy and like see if we could, put the brakes on some of this. Um, and by the time I was done with that, I felt, obviously feeling like we had kind of failed in that effort was a good basis for reflection, but also just really feeling like the constraints I saw in these movements were too profound to ignore any, or to like try to overlook to get something done, something or other.
Mm.
And so I just kind of like went into this phase, as one does in a revolutionary life. You should have like these moments of elevated activity. I mean, these like these moments of tending to your wounds and kind of like thinking about what works and what doesn't.
Mm.
And so I kind of really went into one of those where it was felt like time for a new story, time for a new foundational paradigm.
Mm.
And at this point, I would say, having produced a fairly steady output of media for the last 5 years or so, kind of really reflecting on what uh, new paradigms might look like and what taking seriously some of the sort of like biological aspects of behavior might imply about how to navigate the current crisis we're in. I would say that I feel this sense of momentum and buy-in where I kind of feel like I've managed to like it's no longer a question of going back into the existing movement landscape to try to make something work. I feel like I'm sort of able to do experiments with like-minded people. So
Yeah,
that feels
yeah.
really good.
It- all of those experiences in the environmental movement must have been such an amazing like microcosm of human social dynamics, which is like, kind of the foundation for politics. It, is it almost like Don Quixote by committee that they're taking on this kind of monstrous responsibility and task coming from the best possible motivation of like care and concern for the world, but then you've got the realities of trying to coordinate human beings towards that task, and most of the time expecting to come away feeling unsatisfied with the end result of those efforts.
Yeah, it's so here's the thing though, is that I would say that one of the things that always did leap out at me pretty early on, but then became this like persistent, like, okay, this question needs to be answered thing at some point was that it the social movement landscape is a microcosm of humanity in a sense, but it's really quite striking how it's a pretty distinct subset of personalities who
Yeah,
tend
because they
to
have to
inhabit.
self-select into it.
Yeah,
And I'm
it's
guessing a lot of people get shaken out by the first round of experiences
oh
and don't come
totally.
back. Yeah.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, there's so many interesting facets of that, but like the thing that kind of leaps out if you spend any time in places like that is this, it's like a correlation between attitudes and aptitudes, right? That the people who feel concerned about this stuff enough and maybe like uh, I don't want to use the word credulous, but it's like I don't want to use the word credulous. Like credulous enough of social movement strategy to really like show up. these are people who tend to be good at certain things or to have certain kinds of competencies and like abilities to follow through, and really not to be particularly skilled with other realms of behavior and experience. And so you end up feeling this really particular kind of crazy after a while, where you're like, this isn't the right room full of people. Like maybe in an optimal room full of people, maybe like we should have one or two of these people, but this is a lot of like this kind of person,
Yeah.
and like really almost none of all these other kinds of people who you can like regularly encounter in other spheres of society. And so you really see how there's a certain like range of things that are plausible to even contemplate accomplishing if you're like this very unique aggregate of a very specific temperament, you
Mm.
know.
Well, on a related topic, I'm really fascinated by group structure and dynamics. And
Yeah.
I'm curious how often these kind of groups developed a more formalized structure about like who did what and who had power and who had responsibilities and access to various resources versus I think a more idealistic hope that everyone can just kind of pull in the same direction and you don't need those formal structures. Do you have any thoughts on like that? Have you seen it play out in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, my big picture thought is that it seems like an enduring question to ask about organizing human endeavors of any kind that must have, is a fascinating way to look at human evolution, and cross-cultural anthropology and all that, but is like, how do you enable cooperation and also escape? Like
Mm,
how do you achieve effects that you can only achieve through social complexity and large-scale coordination without creating institutionalized roles that can't be walked away from or aren't interconvertible, where more than one person can't take on the same role, or where somebody's role doesn't allow them to monopolize resources and therefore power.
mm,
Even if, like in the case of, if we were talking about hunter gatherers, maybe the resources and therefore the power would be like a water hole. But we still have like questions like the media platform or the tiny budget of your little direct action group or the office that you get to meet in or whatever it is.
mm,
um, and so what I've always found, I think that when people kind of like come to, it's like somebody coming to their very first political meeting, and there's this sort of like vague sense like, okay, so do we all have to agree on something for anything to happen? And that's kind of, that in itself is like a very large psychological barrier. Some
mm.
people are like, I'm not trying to have a conversation with 20 strangers where we all agree on something. That sounds truly terrible. And it can't be.
Mm,
But like, kind of starting from this premise of what it means to operate by consensus is that if some subset of people in a group process cannot consent on something happening, what they are saying is that they will walk away from
mhm,
that,
mm,
and then you get into this interesting question of, okay, but what if there is an office? But what if there is a media platform? And there's never any clean or totally decisively clear answers to these questions. But what I have learned in my practical experiences of organizing groups of people to do things, which I do really find a lot of fascinating sort of like points of connection, to in the whole, yeah, like the anthropology of egalitarian societies, like, that whole realm, is that you really just want a lot of parallelism.
mm,
Like you want it to be true that you have robust relationships with lots of different people who have media platforms, or lots of different people who can get access to a venue for an event, or whatever the resource bottlenecks are.
mm,
And that it kind of makes everybody the center of their own vast conspiracy. Like you
mm,
are calling open meetings and bringing people into these spaces, without really too much selective criteria other than like you decided to show up. But then the more that you go into that with the assumption that there's going to be processes of fissioning and that that's not just like okay, but that that's success. Like if you
Mm,
bring a bunch of people together and then some subset of them are like, cool, we found each other because of this. And now we're going to do the thing that
yeah,
we have sufficient alignment to do. That's victory.
yeah, yeah.
And we understand that in a lot of other contexts. Like I make this quip, you know, if you organize an orgy and lots of people fission off and do their thing, that's success. Like you
Mm,
don't have to have sex with everyone at the orgy for it to be an orgy, right?
yeah,
But for some reason, there's something about the sort of like disposition, the psychological baggage that comes with dreaming about changing the whole world or whatever, where processes of fissioning feel more like a trauma. They feel like mom and dad got divorced, you know, and
yeah, yeah.
and so it's like I really am trying to promote this thing of like we should look at these, we need these mass structures, but we should look at them as fluid aggregations and we should expect them to always be changing.
Do you think the current idealism around egalitarianism is a kind of constructed reaction to a perceived past of more hierarchical cultures, that we kind of imagined the past was way more rigid and hierarchical than it probably was, and that we're trying to push in the complete opposite extreme to the point where we're missing the potential for some hierarchy, for some structure to be useful?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to ask. I think really like maybe the most fundamental question is it the right frame? You know,
Mm,
like we can do all kinds of research about hierarchy and egalitarianism at any point in the human trajectory or whatever, and kind of look at our contemporary realities in those terms. And it's something that we do quite naturally. You know, it's like
mm,
it's one of the variables that we automatically orient to, and so that's like both a basis for embracing it on some level, but also for really like looking at that and asking like, why is this, you know, why is it if we just have like one political spectrum and that's supposed to encompass everything, why is it, you know, like a left right like hierarchy and egalitarianism? And you know, like often really is that the right question? I mean, another way that we could look at it that I think a very, very much like a missing dimension of analysis is to, again, going back to like the sort of like very different personalities that comprise humanity, is just asking like what kinds of people
mm,
are exercising these different kinds of power. You know, like if we, instead of just looking at the social structure itself, you know, like how much command and control or coordinating oversight does a person in this position have, is like this other question of like, well, who is this person?
yeah.
You know, and so like I've been talking about that some of like how if you look at the history of states, especially like modern states, post-industrial, it's like a whole lot of lawyers and engineers, regardless of the ideology. It's people with a very similar psychology and professional background who are actually administering these
Mm.
systems. And that can't have nothing to do with the outcomes that they produce, you know.
I, excuse me. One example that you've, I think, talked about that I think is really important are traditional societies that regularly move between hierarchical and egalitarian modes of social organization. And I think rather than pretending that there is one ideal level of social structure, it's really about that flexibility of being able to shift between modes appropriately when circumstances change. I think that it's the dynamics of it that might be the missing part of having mechanisms to find the right level of structure for a particular set of circumstances.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I know that something like there are some practical limits that I think should be very explicitly acknowledged. if egalitarian social structures sort of imply, like it's kind of right there in the logical structure, that there's a deliberative process that goes on for any decision that gets made. There are situations that a group can find itself in where you do still have to coordinate, but deliberation is not the right move,
Mm,
especially like extensive deliberation where you
mm,
just don't have time for that. So something that has come up in my own organizing experience is sometimes, a group of people will sit down and like come to consensus on what we're doing. But then when it's time to actually do it, and there could be real consequences, like somebody could get arrested or whatever, if we don't all just kind of, it's like we have appointed one person to just decide what's happening in a given
mm,
moment.
mhm,
And that is like, that's giving somebody power, but it is also like, you could just walk away from that situation, right?
mm,
It's
mm.
not, it's not it's a very particular kind of power that again we hear about a lot in the literature of like somebody sort of making group decisions, but there's still this active consensus going on because there's no real basis for coercive enforcement per se. It's just that somebody is taking, a hierarchy in the sense of decision making power, but not like a dominance hierarchy in the sense of coercing people into the decision making structure
Yeah,
itself.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, even the most horrific totalitarian autocrat still relies on levels and levels and levels of people acquiescing to decisions that
Totally.
someone else is making. And I think that's just how humans work, and we have to keep working to get a better handle on it. A kind of related topic, because this series of experiments you've been doing around tree worship that I really wanted to talk about and get some like more reflections on how it's going. Um, and the reason why I think that's connected, do you think that those kind of rituals are and those practices are necessary for building group feeling so that coordination is more possible?
Yeah, that's yes is the simple answer, and that is a really I think a totally crucial additional dimension of analysis for any discussion of hierarchy and egalitarianism or group decision making in general, is that there's such a radical difference between a group that has a sort of sense of shared purpose and kind of like direct participation in something that collectively matters versus a group that doesn't,
Mm,
and a whole lot of conflict, regardless of how the group is structured, a whole lot of conflict and averse experiences in general, um, that will end up getting conceptualized as uh, flaws of decision making structure are really just because there isn't cohesion, because there's
mm,
not like a true, because the group doesn't exist in a meaningful emergent sense beyond it being this aggregation of people who are trying to like do something but just don't have, yeah, like a psychological cohesion happening.
mm,
um and yeah, so that's again like, with all this stuff, it's sort of like I could I can argue from it from a very sort of theory heavy or like a more academic perspective, or just from the practical experience of uh, the projects that I've engaged in throughout my life, where one of the most just absolutely striking things that you see is that when people feel a sense of skepticism or even outright defeat about what they're doing, or they feel afraid, there's a level of repression or whatever happening, the the lines of division become so much more pronounced and are so much more fiercely litigated.
mm,
And then, and you can spend, I've literally had experiences of spending years trying to get something to happen and it just feeling like wading through this morass of endless, personalities, And then like the moment that there is some sense of accomplishment or unified purpose, the moment that you get what in politics is usually called momentum,
Mm,
but from a group psychological perspective we would just call like a sense of group solidarity and cohesion. This stuff that you've been trying to do forever just it just happens, right? Like
mm,
people are just like, oh yeah, that would be it, let's just go do that right now, you know. And
hmm hmm
suddenly the like, you know, the hours of anguish dialogue are just evaporate. And yeah, so over time I feel like I've been in enough processes in group contexts where I really did just experience the need for a set of cohering rituals of some kind.
mm,
Um, and I think the other thing about, well, there's all kinds of like different facets of doing this, but I think I'm also just really experiencing this need, you know, just in getting responses from people. It seems like there's some sense of just a need for processing, for psychologically integrating what is happening in the world right now
hmm
that is difficult or too impossible to do alone. And so there's this kind of like inherent need that people have to come together and sort of collectively acknowledge the sacredness of life in order to really process the threats that life is currently under. And then that to me is a far more plausible basis for if you want to organize some specific set of projects, that seems kind of like where I've come to is that should be the foundation. That, you
mm.
know, like instead of getting people together and being like, okay, now let's do this little, you know, like food reserve system or whatever, it's like that would come out of this more sort of fundamental process of collective engagement and psychological processing, awe and connection to the world that serves its own purpose. So you can't lose
Mm.
because you're doing something you need to do one way or the other. And then if it generates momentum for other things, yeah.
In some ways, would that be imitating like established religions that they build a community based on more esoteric kind of feelings and outlooks and rituals that actually like make it more than just a piece of paper with some ideas on it. And then from that foundation, you can do charity in the community. You can actually, you can apply political pressure, or, there's various things that come as a result of having that community already cohesive.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is quite striking. It does seem like the people who are really managing to exert the most political power, at least here in the United States where I live, that's the foundation of it.
Mm,
And, you know, it seems like almost everywhere else, there are some exceptions, but almost everywhere else, there's this process of fragmentation occurring that is, you know, intensifying both in terms of like the level of distance people experience from one another, but also like the specificity of who feels alienated from who according to what like niche subcultural sort of tendencies they possess or whatever. It just seems like there's a general process of disconnection happening in most of mass complex industrialized societies, and that people who have that religious foundation as a basis for exercising power, Christian nationalists in the case of the United States, are able to like kind of withstand some of those forces and exercise a much more cohesive and coherent political program than you really see any of their opposition exercising.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yes, so the short answer would be yes, it is a lot.
Do you want to tell us a bit about what you've been trying to roll out with, I believe you've been starting a regular group of people coming together to do forms of nature worship. How's that experience actually gone?
Yeah, it's been quite interesting. I would say obviously, there's I could tell two really different stories about it. There is definitely some foundation of, an existing scene here that I already feel connected to, that allows me to kind of like try out these different experiments and, organize different events with at least some nexus of connection to something that's already happening.
Mm.
So that is true. But then at the same time, um, this sort of like level of immersion is new for me, and definitely has this kind of like central feature of it, I would say, is just sort of overcoming whatever reservation or awkwardness or self-consciousness or sense of inauthenticity or whatever that comes with, like going from this conceptual inference, like, okay, we're all having these experiences of reverence and connection, reverence for, a connection with, and awe at the living world. And I think we need to like find an institutionalized way to express this together. Like, that's pretty easy to have and to say in like a podcast. But then there is something distinctly about, I don't know, the society we live in, the culture that we inhabit's sort of rewarding of ironic distancing
Yeah,
and,
yeah,
detachment, where it's a significant, it's a psychologically significant process, let's just say that, to really just sort of lean into this and be like, okay, let's try to do this thing together and just see how it goes. But yeah, I mean, I've been doing it. Right now, what I feel capable of organizing is like 8 events a year. But I think that there would be I think we would cross some very interesting threshold if we could do something like once a week or something, even if it
mm.
was like very small. And obviously it couldn't involve like a ton of preparation, but um,
Do you think there's any possibility of coordinating those kind of communal practices through a digital shared experience? Or is there something quintessentially like valuable about in-person, like a group feeling?
it's hard to say. I really don't know. I know that I've had experiences like watching ethnographic films of like Bushman rituals where I started just doing the thing they were doing spontaneously and felt like I had this really wild experience. So I think something like that is certainly conceivable. Um, I I tend a little bit towards the uh, cautious about digital representations because they so often seem to like subsume
Mm,
whatever they're supposed to represent.
yeah.
The representation becomes so central.
My gut
Yeah,
feeling is that they need to be participatory. If you're just watching something happen on a screen, it's
yeah,
never going to work. But if you know that everybody is doing the same thing at the same time, then you've got your own embodied something happening that you are part of.
yeah. And that's exactly, like, to me that feels like the sort of like distinction, the chasm that I'm trying to like leap across right now is from the territory of doing stuff that is still like kind of essentially presenting something to what is essentially an audience, to asking people to directly bodily participate in a ceremony,
Yeah, yeah.
so that, and yeah, I don't, yeah, exactly. I think we have to be doing the thing. But this idea, this broad notion of identifying sacred trees and doing ceremonies around them and tying that in to the notion of like, there's this awakening of a sort of a kind of religion, if that's the best thing to call it, but this kind of religion or whatever that is in alliance with life and the evolutionary process, and like
Mm, mm.
that it's something that this idea that it's an awakening that's everywhere and that people can go do this, that I'm very into. but yeah, directly like transmitting any particular instance of it, I probably wouldn't.
Well, I would make a comparison with the impact of writing on religion in the axial age. So up until that point, writing was for like tax receipts. Like it was the vast majority of any written
It's
text before that
accounting.
age.
Yeah.
It was just completely boring. Like nobody thought anything was particularly important about it. But then through experimentation, groups of cultures figured out how to make things like Bibles and Torahs and Qurans. And they took that old, very boring medium and repurposed it for a completely new um, activity. And the technology scaled. It allowed you to have monotheism on like continent-wide scales. Whereas before you had all of these little pockets of like disconnected traditions that, they got completely steamrolled when that new technology found a way of becoming religious. And I wonder if the internet is at that same moment that nobody's quite figured out. I mean, like, think about televangelist TV programs that have been around since the 80s. They're really like a poor substitute for people who, are too poor or too unwell to get out to a megachurch and experience it in the
Yeah.
flesh. But if someone could make that experience better than going to a megachurch, yeah, no, I think the possibility is there, but it's going to take a lot of experimentation. It's going to require using the medium in a way that people haven't thought to do before.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I had one question too. So you're exploring communal ritual practices around what you've identified as sacred, significant trees. And how have you chosen those trees? And if the movement ever became popular enough to get noticed by the surrounding culture, would you worry about the safety of those trees, that they could become targets for countercultural movements?
Yeah, I actually have thought about that a lot. I guess because where a lot of this comes from for me is the forest defense thing, and that happened. That was a dynamic, is that there would be some campaign, some blockade, whatever, and sometimes you would win, and then people would go kill the trees you had been protecting as an act of spiritual warfare or whatever.
Mm,
So I do think about that. Uh, but there's also like a weird kind of power in the fact that it could become a basis for conflict, where
mm,
if you were looking for something fairly like low barrier that could really bring people together, protecting the tree would be such a thing. Um, and then in terms of selecting them, I feel I feel like this is just a formalization of something that people do, that I know that I've been doing since I was a little kid. And in talking about it, lots of people have approached me and told me about the tree or trees that play this role in their lives and in the landscapes they inhabit, which is just that I feel like everywhere I've lived with trees, there's always these moments, these places that feel really special, and these particular trees that you always at least kind of notice, like the minimum is you're like, wow, but
mm.
that often I've gone to and had some kind of sense of wanting to be close to, or like going to visit or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's very common, and that's really, it's when and people usually just know.
I think I suggested to you that you should consider the shocking power of worshipping invasive species.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
you've got a lot
mm-hmm.
of really charismatic tree species in the US that are popping up all over the place, that they're this kind of unstoppable force. And if you flip around the narrative to these being horrible and they need to be poisoned and cut down and burnt, to actually, we think these things are sacred and we appreciate them, could be so shocking. And it's also, you're kind of picking the winning side ecologically.
Totally, yeah,
Because, like, no matter how hard the authorities try, there's just no way they're ever going to stop these particular species.
yeah. Yeah, and I definitely fall on that side of this sort of endless discourse around invasive species, where a lot of it I do find kind of weird, and like another instance of that. What if we just froze time in this one sort of imaginary set of conditions and kept everything like that? And I'm like, I don't think that's either possible or desirable,
Yeah, yeah.
um, but and maybe this just reflects terrible ignorance on my part, but I can think of, like further south, eucalyptus forests are totally coming to, and those landscapes are quite striking. And I could very easily imagine eucalyptus worship, how, like
Hmm.
rites in the eucalyptus grove is easy for me to picture. Here, where I am on the west side of the Cascades, I actually can't think of a really prominent non-native tree species that's really like, yeah,
Not yet.
taking large. Yeah, not yet. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Uh, now, would you like to tell me a bit more about your concept of the biological singularity? Because I think this is another, like, again, it's the branding of this, the wrapping it up in that language instantly gets people like, what?
Right, right.
Yeah, t tell us what that means to you and like how you develop that concept.
Well, this is it's funny because it seems like there's a tendency towards greater complexity and integration, let's say, that is just broadly observable across the entire history of the Earth, I guess the universe, right? And it gets talked about in lots of different ways in different scientific and philosophical dialogues, sometimes with a whole lot of what I think Michael Levin called telophobia. There's a lot
Hmm.
of like, but this it's not some inevitable law of the, and I'm like, I don't know what the difference is between saying that's where the system tends towards greater complexity as a kind of like teleological status, and just saying there's something about the dynamics of the system that seem to just keep creating that. So we might as well notice that that does seem to keep happening and might not stop anytime soon.
Mm.
But like the reason I chose that phrasing was because in these dialogues around the technological singularity, there was always sort of citing everything that had happened up to this very moment as that trajectory towards
Mm.
everything becoming more complex, a nested dolls sort of like syndrome, entities aggregating into meta entities, into meta entities. And then they would draw this line and say, like, so that's the nature of reality or the universe, and we should embrace that. So now we have to intervene in this very specific way and develop all this industrial technology, and do this one kind of very, so that we can continue this process. And my counterpoint to that has always been like, wait, you're talking about something that didn't require these particular interventions to keep happening over the course of billions of years. Why should we assume that unless we have server farms, that this just stops happening? So it's a way of orienting towards that very exciting idea that evolution isn't over,
Mm.
and that not only is, it's not like over in the sense of new species are emerging, but that truly qualitatively new, you know, phenomena could emerge that exist in relation to complex multicellular life with complex societies, as those phenomena do to, single-celled entities and bacterial colonies or whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But
Yeah,
to like orient to that idea, but outside of the like Silicon Valley paradigm.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, we've got, depending on who you believe, 100 million years of like complex life left on Earth. That's
Right.
that's like the time from when the dinosaurs went extinct twice over
Yeah.
that we have to play around with. And there's been so many phase changes in the dynamics of life where it's suddenly, you know, you if you tuned in the first few billion years, you'd be like, oh, it's bacteria. Oh, there's more bacteria.
Yep.
Boring. And then suddenly something completely different happens, like ice gradually warming up until it all melts into water, and suddenly it behaves completely differently. And yeah, opening people's eyes up to the possibility. Well, not the possibility, the apparent inevitability that
Seeming inevitability.
this process is going on, and that humans, even if we're not, building ChatGPT, are likely to be part of that process.
Yeah.
If only temporarily, hopefully not, but if not, yeah,
Yeah.
we're definitely part of the mix.
Yeah, and I think that that plays into a sense of, to me, that is sort of inherently quite, let's say, spiritual, or I would say also like kind of mythical, like this
Mm,
sense that we're participating inevitably in this process of escalating complexity, and there's different forms of it that we could choose, and some of them are quite nightmarish, and some of them are nightmarish and beautiful, and
mm,
and there's just all of these different, right? That is quite a, as far as like bases for awe go, that's like really that's a potent one. And yeah, I mean, so I guess I do kind of take that seriously as one of the sort of like foundational assumptions or sense of a mandate that
mm. Would you
weaves
call
into this.
Would you call it post-tragedy environmentalism? Because so much of the environmental movement has been this kind of dirge and this mourning and this panic about preventing, more of what's been happening for probably centuries now, thousands of years, if you really want to look back.
Yeah.
That we've been having all of these admittedly negative impacts on the world and on ourselves. And yeah, to reframe that whole tradition in an even broader way, that there's some non-linear hope, I think is the way I would put it.
Yeah, no, 100%. I would totally concur with that. And that is some very much like a central kind of like theme of what I'm trying to articulate. And I would say that it was a lot of work and kind of a lot of perilous work for me to try to disentangle or to sort of like transcend the psychological impacts of inhabiting catastrophic environmentalism for so long,
Mm, mm,
and just kind of like being in this place of like, we failed and every day is worse than the last day because every day is more of that failure.
yeah.
And and just like, but like getting to this place of really seeing how that wasn't mobilizing me or doing anything, helping me do anything interesting or worthwhile. And so, yeah, so kind of wanting to spread a different gospel of a different way to participate in and hold life sacred, but yeah, without quite so much of the perennial crushing sense of loss.
Yeah.
And
See, that's where I see the potential of something like a communal ritual where you go out and like celebrate the tree of heavens covered in spotted lanternflies as the most beautiful and extraordinary thing. That it's a transformation, that it doesn't have to be seen as this pestilence and this tragedy. It's
yeah,
life doing its thing.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's I in these ceremonies, like, okay, so I'm, I guess, a week away from what here in the northern hemisphere is the autumn equinox, and that's totally the quality that we're trying to convey. We're hanging all of these ornaments, we're making all these circular ornaments on this black cottonwood tree, and then we're giving them out to everybody and saying, take this particular tangible thing and put it on the sacred tree that is closest to you in your life.
Hmm.
But also, we're kind of spreading, we're spreading rain and we're spreading green new life from this cottonwood. We're like, we are this sort of life promoting and evolution facilitating force that is spreading from this circle we've made around this tree in all directions. Yeah, and it's very much, it's just not caught up in catastrophism and grief. I don't know. That's really just the simple way to put it.
Yeah, yeah. Have you noticed much of a response or transformation in the people coming along to participate? What have their reports back to you been?
Yes, yeah. No, it's been quite uh encouraging. I would say like in what I've done with my life, there's a whole lot of kind of just like shopping ideas out or sort of like just trying things out, and
Mm,
as long as you don't inhabit this frame of mind of if something doesn't take off, it's a failure. If you're sort of like, I'm just experimenting with stuff, you can end up cycling through all kinds of different projects and gauging people's responsiveness. And I've done so much of that, just so much. And I will say that this really seems to be something where people kind of respond with a level of engagement and mobilization that makes me feel, I'm always skeptical of people looking for the one true thing that
mm,
we
mm.
should be doing or whatever. But I'm kind of like, but if there was something like that, this would be it.
I mean, looking at the evolution of American national holidays over history, I think is a really good example about how different things kind of get added into the mix and change the tradition. But it's a bundle of different things that people expect to do together to mark an occasion. So
Yeah,
yeah, and you're kind of just trying one ingredient at a time. It's
yeah,
uh it's going to take a while to build up to it feeling like a feast.
yeah, yeah,
Mm.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Totally.
Now, there's a particular episode of Fight Like an Animal which when I heard it, it was one of these things that just caught my imagination so strongly. It was around the idea that these widespread reports of ape-like humans, like Sasquatch and Yetis, and there's like pretty much everywhere in the world that has a decent-sized forest, there's some tradition reporting seeing these entities. And you were exploring the possibility that at least some of them could just be humans that underwent a different developmental pathway because every organism has plasticity. And I think ultimately, even if this theory is completely wrong, just highlighting the overlooked plasticity in everyday humans is something really, really amazing. Um, so anyway, I'll ramble a little bit longer. The thing that really made me think of, there was a photograph I saw of a set of identical twin girls who started doing gymnastics as children, and one of them dropped out when she was like 8, and the other one went on to like Olympic level gymnast. And it was a photo of these girls side by side. They were a foot difference in height. Their physical development was just completely different. And it made me realize that the childhood that we offer to most young humans in the developed world robs them of the ability to fully develop their physical potential. Like they're never going to be as strong or as agile or as coordinated as they could be because we've made them sit in plastic chairs and learn algebra for the first, 20 years of their life. But I wonder if there's psychological flexibility in our development as well that is completely overlooked. And yeah, I don't know. Do you want to comment on like that whole idea? Because I just found it so fascinating.
Oh no, I mean 100%. I think that we cannot understand the dynamics of the complex societies that we inhabit without really kind of explicitly looking at their developmental impacts in a way that we don't do as much as we should. And that, yeah, I mean, the Sasquatch as a developmental possibility of humanity thing, it may or may not be true. There is some uncannily compelling evidence for it, but
Mm,
whatever. But yeah, like really the motivation for me in making that was to just point out this idea that we have massively differentiated, both like in the sense that we've all differentiated from various potentials that would have been expressed ancestrally, but then also we've differentiated from one another. because we inhabit such different roles and have such different developmental contexts
Mm.
in complex societies, right? And that we just can't understand what's happening or how we can address any kind of collective action problem without really thinking about all the different changes in neurophysiology that every aspect of living the way we do has, just the whole tangle. Um, but so it's obviously the Sasquatch hypothesis involves some like gross anatomical shifts and everything. It does kind of seem though, I mean, I think where I started, because with a lot of this stuff, it's like you'll start researching something where it's like 33% a joke. And then by the time you're done, you're like, it's now like 12% a joke. Like I
Well,
think where
I should, for the people who don't know this field, I should throw in that there are many solid reports of wild children. So children who were abandoned into the wilderness when they were like toddlers, they somehow found a way of surviving, and they uniformly have astonishing physical prowess. Their
yeah,
ability to move is way beyond normal humans. Even well-trained athletes often can't do what these children somehow learnt to do. And there's a smaller number that are reported to have like a light covering of hair over their body, which might be a response to just being cold when they were a toddler, like every night, that there's some capacity for your body to respond to that in ways that we normally don't think are possible.
exactly. And that's when I was really kind of like, okay, maybe, my sense of the confidence interval of the likelihood of this is sort of shifting. Was I think it's in Linnaeus. He lists two different human species in his big taxonomy, the whatever, I forget what it's called, but and one of them is like feral human.
Mhm.
And yeah, he lists like quadrupedal locomotion and being covered in hair and superhuman strength
Yeah.
as qualities. And I guess that just really struck me for some reason. So compelled some further research. Um, and yeah, the literature on feral children is quite fascinating in and of
Mm.
itself.
Mm.
Huge window into just the general developmental plasticity that we possess, because it's not just one syndrome. There's such diverse manifestations of it. Like some kids end up either being raised by or just being in proximity to some other species of animal and adopt their behaviors to a large extent.
Mm.
Um, and there are cases where like a kid became essentially amphibious, he like really never got out of the water, stuff like that.
Mm.
Um, so it points us to uh, this general sense that there's all kinds of possibilities we usually don't see. But in particular, humans, as we think of them cross culturally, are a very, neotenous species. Our development is very prolonged. We're always engaging in, no matter what culture you're looking at least the very significant environmental modification of maintaining a fire of some kind,
Mhm.
right? There's all these sort of traits that we possess that can only exist if there's a cooperative division of labor, alloparenting, all of this stuff. And so this question of like, well, what would happen if you ran this experiment as nature has of feral kids sometimes just ending up raising themselves over and over again?
Yeah.
Would you
How far
sometimes
could it
get,
go? Yeah, how far would it go?
and then the final thing that really blew my mind was a paper that just got published in 2023, which right before I did the episode, where there was this fairly famous case where some people had captured what they called, it was in the Caucasus Mountains, so they used the term almasty, but a Bigfoot or whatever. And she lived in captivity for decades and was reported to be covered in hair, had superhuman strength. some contemporary researchers found where she was buried, and no, found where, yes, found where she was buried, and did genetic analysis on one of her sons and on her, and she's human. She's
Mm,
just recognizable descendant of a population of African humans who came to that region during the slave trade in the Ottoman Empire. And so that was quite compelling.
and again, it's a hopeful message because it says that there's a whole range of flexibility and other ways of approaching living as a human. We're not as locked into the current culture and lifestyle that we think we're kind of trapped in. That mm,
Well, and that really gets into what we were talking about right before we started recording, of this sort of the sense that talking about human behavior and social behavior as biological is kind of taboo in a
mm,
lot of
mm,
realms of culture and politics. It's like the way that it's consistently been presented is as a sort of biology versus plasticity
mm,
divide, right?
mm,
And just like, I think that's not so much wrong as incoherent. I'm like,
mm,
behavior is always going to be biological. So you can always be asking, what is the biology of any given behavior? But yeah, sort of like explicitly attuning to the way that biological potentials are differentially expressed under different developmental contexts and social situations,
mm.
to me makes a lot more sense than this other way that revolutionaries and dreamers have so frequently gone about it, of just sort of positing some ideal, or like some set of desirable conditions, and just imagining you're going to kind of like argue your way to them, like convince everybody with reasoning or whatever.
Mm.
Two very different frames.
It's really interesting that the whole conversation around biology and culture and politics is still basically a poisoned well. And from what my reading, this can be traced back to the Nazis went to one extreme where everything was just genetics. And, if you just get rid of the bad genes, then you have a utopia. Whereas the Soviets were like, oh no, genes don't matter at all. We don't even believe DNA exists. When they got really extreme, everyone's a infinitely flexible blank slate that we can
Right.
enculturate them to be anything. And both of those were pushed to extremes for political reasons. The science was kind of steamrolled in both directions to create a very simple model. But as a result, like of the tragedy from both of those approaches, we seem to have been left like incoherent or in, like so afraid to approach either way of looking at the reality of the situation because we worry that oh no, that's going to veer off into one extreme or the other. And yeah, it's a really, I mean, it's understandable, but like it's been nearly a century. Like how long do we have to keep tiptoeing around this issue and being afraid of it?
Yeah, uh, and it's quite remarkable, I think, particularly at this point, because there's such a widespread sense that we've sort of tried everything and it's failed and the world just doesn't make sense. But, we've already tried all the big organizing frameworks for trying to figure out a good way to live together in this world. And to me, we really haven't gotten to square one if everything we're doing is coming out of one of the other of these very schismatic paradigms. And we do not have a way to talk about biology and plasticity in an integrated fashion. I mean, I'm not saying that if we did, it would solve all our problems, but I
Mm.
am saying I think incoherence and futile efforts are more or less guaranteed if we don't have like a useful way
Yeah,
to.
an integrated way.
Yeah.
You may not know this, and I don't know this. Are there any cultures or political bodies, for want of a better word, around the world that you think are closer to a reconciliation or avoiding this kind of false dichotomy? Like maybe Japan? I don't know how they approach this kind of issue.
Not that I know of. And I know that at one point somebody who was helping me with a project actually did do a little research, like a kind of a landscaping effort to just see like is are other people talking about this in a way that overlaps or whatever? And she really couldn't find much.
Mm, mm.
Um, so yeah, I don't really think so.
One related movement, and you're at least geographically close to, I think, the leading edge of this. The medically assisted dying culture that's, I know in Canada has become quite prominent. I think in your part of the US it's more advanced. Like, what do you think that might be related? That like uh, at least tackling the kind of blanket fear of death and dying, which seems so prominent in Western cultures. Do you think that might be part of a cultural transformation that allows us to get a functional handle on the biological basis of like human society?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's an interesting question because I could see that being one path in. It does seem like it certainly goes beyond just biology. It's like there is just kind of this fear of like physical reality or causality or, this sort of like desire to maintain these this sense of transcendence from almost everything, but certainly everything that's like corporeal or could be seen as like dark or aggressive or
Mm,
I don't know. It's quite. I don't totally feel like I really understand where this aversion comes from, to be honest. Like I said, I can remember beginning to like engage in evolutionary theory about human behavior when I was a kid. It always just seemed natural to me. And certainly the Nazis had a big role in shaping social science schisms, but that schism was already there
mm,
before then.
mm,
If you go into like very early 20th century anthropology, you see that it seems like what they did was extend. They started with they started with anti-racism, but then just became opposed. Just they started with anti-racism, but then seemed to have become quickly opposed to biology in general because it was being invoked to describe differences between whole groups of people. So then this sort of like vast conceptual slippage happens where they're saying, well, there's just no biology involved in any human behavior at all.
mm,
Quite, these are actually two very distinct. You could, in fact, posit a universal human, biological human nature that would indeed act as like I don't know. It's a lot of sort of like not very lucid and awfully categorical thinking. And then if you go even further back to foundational political thinkers like John Locke in the case of liberalism, or Marx, or the first people who wrote as anarchists, you see some form of this here too. Where they're saying, well, humans are capable of organizing societies into any structure that we want because nature has retreated and reason has come to the fore, because we are not animals, we are humans, because the body doesn't matter, the mind is ascendant. Some form of this binary
mm.
is just kind of like right there in the way that people have reasoned about this stuff since they really started explicitly reasoning about it on paper. Just, and so I don't know. I don't know like what sort of reconnects, because ultimately it's not a question of an argument. Like I think we've had enough nature nurture dialogue now that we know there's not like the piece of evidence any more than talking about like climate change or something. It's uh that's not the question. It's a question of, yeah, what psychologically prepares people to sort of look at the world in this more integrated, causally coherent way.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's
But I have to
interesting.
at least,
Oh, sorry. No, you go.
yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that. I have to at least imagine, and I do know of cases where my project has done this, we're just using this reasoning to talk about making the world better in some way, or like solving problems, or like talking about this in a way that reflects empathy and a concern for the global ecosystem. That does go a long way
Mm.
towards, just modeling it goes a long way towards making people realize that you're not inherently a genocidal maniac the moment that you start talking about some brain structure or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. One thing I think that is upon us is the collision of rationalist science. Like you said, that kind of the mind has transcended. We have a grip on things. We've, we're no longer animals, that kind of thing. That kind of mindset, that reductionist materialist science, is on a collision course with the complexity of biology, because we now we have as many, piles of DNA sequences that you could ever want, and we still really don't know what to do with that information. We're scrambling around and we're picking out like little things, and like occasionally something really clear drops out. But for the majority of what is the phenomenon of life and of humanity, it doesn't actually give us a tool of absolute control. So I think there has to be a reconciling at some point that is it's beyond our ability to just, make it a formula and say, okay, we've solved everything. And that we need different cultures and different strategies for managing that complexity to the best, possible end.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like there was something that happened in physics starting a century ago or so, where all of these sort of breathtaking, disorienting results started accumulating with, relativity and all of that, where it was like they were invitations to ask about the nature of reality itself.
Hmm.
And I feel like to some extent, maybe they just kind of got there first. But I also feel like to some extent, physics was allowed to get its weirdness was acknowledged earlier because it was sort of like in the prestige hierarchy of like this is maximally technical and remote from, there was something about the way it was kind of experientially distant that made it
You don't
safer.
feel personally attacked when you learn, oh, they found a
Exactly.
new kind of quark. But when it's
Yeah,
like, oh, this gene might contribute to this personality trait, that's personal. That's political.
totally. Yeah. And the more attached we are to the outcome of an inquiry, the more likely we are to not really succeed in, making progress in that inquiry. And
Mm,
so it feels sort of like biology is now coming to the fore as a discipline that is also producing these results that have this kind of paradigm shattering, at least if the mechanistic worldview is your paradigm, these
mm,
sort of like paradigm shattering implications. Um, and yeah, so like I think it's right to associate what's happening more broadly, really, even with science, of just sort of we do seem to be, if there's like a pendulum swing between holism and reductionism, that's kind of always happening in philosophy and science. It does seem right now like there is this kind of big push towards a more integrated way of looking at science in general.
mm,
And certainly some of this question of how do we take a more biologically coherent approach to asking questions about human social structure and political possibilities and stuff like that. That has to like be in that mix somewhere for sure.
mm.
Yeah, two things must be related.
And now the really big question, how do you think that changing grasp on biology could evolve through what I think we both are expecting is going to be the winding down of industrial civilization sometime in the 21st century, like in a prolonged kind of protracted way. But now that we have these kind of different ways of looking at biology, do you think they are going to, well, survive as traditions for one thing, or adapt like through what could be a very chaotic and transformative kind of period in human history?
Um, Yeah, I think it's totally possible. I think that particularly the more that the kind of integrative approach to biology encourages participation as
Hmm.
opposed to an overview, you know, like prediction control and a distance overview of the system.
Yeah.
It kind of like allows all these practical pathways in, you know, like I'm a giant Michael Levin fan, and
Mm.
I like how some of his stuff, if there was like a theory behind it, I don't know what it was, you know, but some of the stuff he kind of just experiments, you know, like scrape some tissue from a frog and culture it and watch it turn, you know,
Yeah.
morphologically shift into some totally new aggregate of cells that behaves in a completely unexpected way. It's like the more of that kind of a paradigm there is that is like really it's like a hacker paradigm, you know,
Yeah.
it's what
Yeah.
you do, right?
Yeah.
That stuff will survive as long as there's people who have the cognitive capacities and the material circumstances to like want to ask interesting questions. Stuff like that will be there. I grieve imagining that people won't, you know, that I can just get on a scientific literature database and find these fascinating results that for the foreseeable future would require vast arrays of technology that, you know,
I was about to say, I imagine at some point in the future, the last genome will be sequenced, and then the
yeah,
technical
right,
capability of doing that, or of the supercomputers that you need to like handle all the data, will no longer be possible. And that era of insight, and it is useful. Like it isn't nothing,
totally,
but
totally.
I think we overestimated how transformative it would be, and that at some point it's going to be a legend that there used to be this like magic series of letters that's inside every cell. If you can even see cells anymore, I think microscopy will probably survive. It's
I think so.
technologically simple enough. But yeah, to sequence a genome and then analyze all of that scramble of data, I think that might be limited to the 21st century.
Yeah, yeah. We could ask. I think it's permissible to speculate, although, you know, if I were to make a confidence interval about this, it would be, you know, like mostly I would mostly not see this happening, but we could ask if biological computing could come far enough in short enough a time
Yeah,
that you
yeah,
don't need the current infrastructure. That
yeah.
is, and what we mean by that could be so many different things. So it wouldn't necessarily be like a biological screen giving you like this Zoom call we're on right
Mm,
now, but
mm.
you know, but something that does somehow work its way through huge data sets, you know, like genetic
I,
data sets or something else.
this is something I wonder about. If you look at savant human minds, could you have the right kind of human savant who could actually sit there reading a printout of a genetic sequence and some do something useful with that information, like recognize patterns in some meaningful way? I think it might be beyond what humans could, I mean, trains and those kind of things. I can imagine them being interesting enough to a human mind, but just a series of four letters that goes on for millions and millions of letters. I don't know if any human mind could ever find that interesting enough to actually analyze with a raw brain power,
Yeah, yeah, I don't know.
let alone copy it out by hand. Like imagine a monastery, like copying the Bible out by hand was bad
Right.
enough. But the human genome, doing that with a quill and a parchment. And for what? What would you actually do it for?
Yeah, what actual capabilities would it give you? I mean, I think quite often about how I don't remember where I read this, so I'm not going to insist that this is ethnographically solid, but reading somewhere that druids would spend like decades learning material to recite, that they would die with this just vast
Mm.
repository of narrative that would take like years to even just literally recite, and I think of that in terms of it being a sort of like limit case of like, okay, like this is about how much somebody can, if there's enough social complexity that somebody can kind of devote a lot of their time to just remembering things. And then what does that correspond to in terms of today's knowledge, and how much overlap would you want, like would you want to try to give every like a group of people subsets, but you would want them to be able to sort of like correct each other to some extent, like those are very interesting questions to me,
And as long as people, those expert druids in 100 years aren't memorizing all of the TikTok dances from like this time in history,
Yeah,
like we can
totally.
forget those. They're just a flash in the pan. I mean, I almost wonder if there could be a kind of sense of relief. Like, I don't know. It's a topic I'm really interested in, like the cultural dynamics of losing something like the internet if it ever becomes
Yeah,
unsustainable. And there might even be parts of the world that have already like gained and lost due to like economic issues. I don't know. It's a topic I've got to dig into more. There was one other thing I really wanted to dig into a little bit, as much as you're comfortable. And the people I talk to tend to be really odd people, like that we end up in this particular, part of the cognitive world. And I think most of us kind of started out in a way that made us predisposed to kind of be able to look at the challenges that are ahead of us head on rather than just, going back to watching TikTok dances. But you have an unusual challenge, which I think might have influenced your perspective in that you're dealing with a chronic, serious health issue that gives you a different kind of relationship to technological civilization and like where it and where you in your life might be going. Do you want to like tell us a little bit more about like what that has been like for you?
sure, yeah. I mean, I am currently quite healthy but very dependent on medication. My life depends on immunosuppressant medication because I have a kidney transplant.
Hmm.
So I also have experienced in such extensive detail the whole sort of intensive care regime that current medical technology allows. I was on dialysis for about like more than 2 years. Um, and during that, also had cancer and had to have a major surgery to remove cancer. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I have quite I have quite complex feelings about these sort of like particular medical applications, but then even more broadly, just the sort of like aspects of industrial technology that meet really particular human needs, where there could be like interesting conversations to be had about tiny subsets of the current system that could be allowed to operate in some way where like a whole lot of life would get a lot better for a lot of people, basically.
Mm.
um, I'll say right at the outset, I don't think that my particular medical case is something that if I were managing, if I were the guy who was tasked with just sort of like shutting down the sectors of the industrial economy that I think are superfluous or unjustifiable right now, I would not leave the ability to treat me medically the way that I was. It's so resource intensive and so, but also so like, I mean, that's the thing. I really saw how the current medical paradigm so often really isn't prolonging someone's life. They're just really prolonging their death. You know,
Mm,
it's really dialysis clinics are. One has to think about it in these terms. Um, Even if you're old and your health is such that you're really not trying to do anything, there's not really much like life available to you. If somebody says we have a way to keep you alive, you can avoid this confrontation with death that is otherwise inevitable, but you're gonna just suffer the whole time, and it's
hmm
gonna be terrible for you and everybody around you. It's still gonna be hard for somebody to be like, no, that's okay. I'll just deal with I'll just confront death because that's inevitable. And that's hard. And so there's honestly like this really pretty loaded ethical question with offering people ways to survive, ways to avoid the terror of death
mm.
that really don't like enrich their lives or, you know.
There's an
And
amazing
so,
article I'd recommend people look up. I think it's called How Doctors Die. And it basically is
oh,
case
wow.
studies of when doctors get a diagnosis of advanced cancer. And with almost without exception, they just go home. They don't sign up for all of the treatments and surgeries and radiation chemotherapy because they've seen what people go through and they're like, I would rather just
Yeah.
live what time I have left. And I think, do you think that culture is starting to change? I think with the boomer generation, they were very much, no, just give me everything and put it off as long as possible, no
Right.
matter the cost.
Right.
But I think the next generation's coming through, there's been a cultural shift. And I'm wondering if you're sensing that too, that people are more reluctant to just accept every possible treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but in terms of the actual medical culture, like in terms of what doctors and other medical practitioners will recommend,
Mm,
it's still very much this sort of like intervention at all costs, you
mm,
know. And again, it's like I think that even if people are really skeptical, there's something just so difficult about turning down a way to save your life.
mm.
It's just so hard. So you know,
Do,
so
do
that
you think that,
informs.
well, linking back, do you think there is an opportunity for a new ceremonial or religious culture to spring up around death acceptance and giving people a different kind of support? I know death doulas are starting to become more popular to like guide people through the process of their
Yeah,
final weeks or months. And yeah, I wonder like funerals used to be such a critical part of communal ceremony, and they're still kind of done like there's no feeling left in the way most funerals are done these days. There's no, they're just kind of a hollow imitation of what they used to be in a cultural landscape.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. Actually, at the Equinox event that is about to happen, we have somebody doing a few minute presentation on their kind of natural death care paradigm or whatever, trying to spread that as something that you can just do. You don't have to ask anybody's permission.
Hmm
That as a way that is how we talked about it. There's a process of psychological integration that stuff like that can maybe help facilitate. You're looking at death and in more intimate contact with it, and that shifts the your relationship with it. I definitely, generally speaking, feel very strongly that there is a way that people don't become truly alive until they have gone through some process of confronting the fear of death
hmm
that most people are not doing in the societies we now inhabit. And it's something that when it does happen for people, it kind of happens spontaneously. It's an awareness that they have some big moment of psychological reorganization, and they experience it however they experience it. Maybe this sense of when I die, I'll return to all of these ecological processes that created me in the first place. And there's a sense of connection and endurance or whatever it is, but it tends to happen just very individually
Mm.
and haphazardly, right? And yeah, I think really quite a few fundamental problems could be shifted if we just had more of a way of confronting overwhelming and difficult stimulus in general, but maybe with like death as the most foundational of those or something.
Almost wonder if that tree worship could be linked. Like you regularly visit the tree that your ashes are going to be put on.
Right,
Yeah, something
right.
simple like that. As long as you don't
Yeah.
kill the trees by drowning them in phosphorus.
Yeah, I have thought about that. I had a very powerful experience. An old friend of mine died at a tree sit in the Western Cascades little more than 20 years ago, and I wasn't able to be at the wake or go to where he was, but many years later, somebody took me to the place that he had been and to this particular Western red cedar tree where his friends had hung different stuff that I recognized as his, his tobacco tin and some of his hair and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And really quite such a striking sense that he was still present in the forest and in this community of people who had inhabited that forest.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and yeah, that it just is an example of these possibilities that are waiting for us to explore and discover. Mm. And now, we should probably wrap things up. This has been an amazing talk, but do you want to point people to where they can learn more about your work? I would highly recommend people check out your podcast as well.
Yeah, so I podcast semi-regularly, sometimes in a frenzy, sometimes with pronounced breaks, but there's a whole lot of podcasts under the title Fight Like an Animal that is available on most major platforms. And also the podcasts themselves, a handful of texts and the bibliographies for the podcasts can all be found at my website, againsttheinternet.com. And I would also just point people in the direction of a publishing collective that I'm part of called Severed Branches Press. And we will be releasing a book that I've written sometime, maybe by the time people are listening to this, it'll be there. You could find out by going to the Severed Branches Press website.
Excellent. I'll add all of those links and I will do my best to coordinate the release of this episode to when that book becomes available so people can check it out.
Great.
Mm. Okay, well, Arnold, thank you very much for what is, I knew was going to be an amazing conversation. I always love chatting to you, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's always fun. Anytime.
If you'd like more, sign up for my Substack, where you can get free weekly articles all about my experimental farm and my other adventures. A paid subscription will unlock the archive of past posts. Next week, I'll be talking to Edmund Frost, a resident of the Twin Oaks community and also a founder of Commonwealth Seed Growers, a small seed company dedicated to improving their regional seed system and coordinating other seed growers.